today we do have our speakers with us. We have Rick Bell, who's the editorial director of Workforce Magazine. And then we also have Josh Cameron, and he is the chief strategy officer at Workforce. So I'll hand it off to you guys.
All right.
Thanks, Meg. So thanks to everyone coming along. This is sort of a follow-on from the webinar we did last month. If you didn't see that, some of this content might be jumping a bit ahead. Maybe go back and look at that after. But we'll try and give you enough context as we're going to keep track. And as Meg was saying, interrupt as we're going, ask questions. Rick and I will try and field those as we go through. So we've got a little bit of an update since the last time. We know that this minimum wage clause is in the stimulus bill at the moment. But there's just a little bit of a question around whether that's allowed or not. And that's sitting at the moment with Elizabeth McDonough, I think. I'm pronounced that right, Rick?
Yes,
So it's really an administrative issue. She needs to decide whether it's okay to put it into the budget reconciliation process. It's pretty unclear which way that's going to go. She is a non-partisan role. She's been in that for like 12 years or something, or 8 years. So I don't think there's really any way of knowing which way that will go. And that's going to determine whether when the stimulus bill passes, it's going to include the minimum wage provisions or not. I don't know if you've got any other reads on that, Rick, but that's pretty much the understanding we have at the moment.
Right. Yeah, it's going to, everything I've seen is going to be part of a battle, and it's going to be in Congress, and they're going to argue it out. And now it's interesting to note that it is part of, it's going to encompass federal contractors as well as potential general public. So I think that would come first.
Yeah, I think that part's going to be even easier. Yeah. The other interesting thing that happened, and you might have seen the really good article on the blog about this, is that the paid self-reporting program has already been cancelled. So this was a program that allowed employers to self-report when you found that, oh, actually we've been underpaying these people, we were calculating their overtime using the wrong average rate. You could go and self-report that, and that would be a way of avoiding penalties and liquidated damages. You still obviously have to pay the employees back the money you owed them, but you weren't up for all these penalties and fines. That has basically been cancelled. The Department of Labor, the new Secretary of Department of Labor, is saying that that's not something they're going to do anymore. And that's a direct quote from them there at the end about enforcing the law using all tools available. So I think what we're going to see is Department of Labor getting more serious about enforcing wage and hourly rules, minimum wage, overtime, all of those things. So it's probably a good time to be taking a look at some of this stuff. Okay, so we're going to have a few slides just about some of the economics here of what's happening and what will happen if we do see this increase in the minimum wage. Again, if you missed the last webinar, we talked about when it's going to come in and sort of the process for it. This is going to be more about, hey, what can we do about it? So let's sort of have a think about how this works. Everyone is going to, many people are going to need to be paid more. And then what we're really talking about today is how as a business you can react, how as a HR professional you can react to this. And there's really a few options. And we kind of want to not rule some out, but we think we want to focus today on how you can increase the productivity of your employees. But your other options are price increases. This is probably what most people are thinking of doing. This is a survey that another software company did. You can see that 71% of restaurants are thinking that they'll just increase their prices. We're not saying not to do that. We're just saying that's not the only option, and that there are downsides to that. And obviously in many industries, we had a lot of feedback last time saying that that's not even an option that they had. So people were on government contracts. I think you had some healthcare providers. Not everyone can just go out and say, hey, there's a 10% increase coming through because of the minimum wage changes. We've got a nice little case study here of what happened in Seattle as Seattle brought in their minimum wages. And you can see someone has put the effort into graphing this, and you can see that the hourly rate increased by an average of 3%, but it resulted in a reduction in hours of 6 to 7%. So reducing staff hours. I can see some people in the poll are answering with that. That's certainly something that we've seen happen historically. And again, probably not ideal for those employees, because the whole idea of this is trying to have them take home more. What we really want to talk about today, though, is, hey, what can we do to increase the productivity of your people? And what can you do internally to do that, so that we don't need to increase prices, we don't need to reduce profit margins, the services we offer, all the hours people are working. So obviously a little bit of this happens naturally. This is a really exciting graph about how this has sort of trended over time. And you can see a little bit before Meg's time, there was some fairly good growth. And that's probably like this, you can really think about this, like think about the revolution, like this industrial revolution, really things kicking in, and a lot of automation in the workforce helped make people more productive. But you can see in the last 13 years, it's been pretty flat, 1.5% a year. So that's how much better employees are getting at doing their work. And that's sort of, this is an overall metric. But the main point I wanted to get across here is I don't think that the productivity increases are going to come for free. This isn't going to be something that everyone gets. This is going to be businesses working it out, HR departments working with operations people, thinking about how they can get some productivity gains. It's not just going to be something that happens because computers were invented or like something easy. Yeah. So that's really the first half. We're sort of setting the theme there. What we want to get onto is just some more practical ideas for things that you can do. I'm going to pass over to Meg for a couple of these, but the 5 that we're going to cover today, probably just the 5 sort of simplest, most effective ones that we could think of. And for the first 2, Meg's going to sort of take it as over some of the pros and cons of them, and then we'll come back to me for the last 3. So I'll pass over to Meg now to talk about upskilling.
Awesome. Yeah, so upskilling, really what it is just making your employees more productive. And there's some good things to it, and then there's always going to be some considerations. And overall, efficiency is going to increase. Employees are going to be able to get more done in less time, which is obviously good for the business. And it also will improve employee engagement. So there's going to be higher satisfaction with employees as they're achieving their defined metrics and receiving regular training, because regular training is something that is a part of upskilling. And then also it'll help you stay competitive. So if you're always reevaluating your business operations and learning new skills in a way to stay ahead of competition and industry trends, this is good. Like I've seen it with a lot of retail companies. I'm sure we all notice some retail companies are doing really well. You have your Amazons, you have your Targets, you have your Walmarts that really transitioned pretty quickly and have redone a lot of their business operations to succeed. And then you have your other companies like your Sears and just a lot of stores like that that are pretty much completely under. So upskilling is actually a really good way to always stay competitive in the market. But then with that, there's also some things to consider. So we're going to have to redefine training processes. So upskilling requires consistent training. So you always are going to be training, and it's going to be different than those like old-fashioned training policies that HR usually has, like training by presentations and PowerPoints and sitting everyone in a room. Upskilling training is really best done with short videos and hands-on learning throughout an employee's time with the company. And then another thing to consider with upskilling is if your company has employees that are in somewhat of like a physical role, you're really risking some like employees increasing on the job injuries. And that's not due to anything that we're not training them to do, but a lot of times if employees feel like they have a metric and they're afraid they're not going to hit it, they might cut corners and not practice standard safety regulations in order to hit their metrics. So that's always something to watch out for. And then I would say the last thing to really consider is just frustration from employees and customers. Some employees are going to love it, but then you also have those employees that are resistant to change. They like the old way of doing things. And then also from a customer perspective, especially if it's not implemented correctly and if you have a lot of regulars, customers will notice a difference in business operations, and sometimes they don't always appreciate that. So just a few things you consider with upskilling. And then to move on to cross-training. So cross-training, the good things about it is, again, it's going to increase employee morale. Adding a variety of tasks and knowing that they are valued to the company, this is going to have a positive impact on overall satisfaction. Especially with a lot of hourly roles, sometimes it can be very tedious, a lot of repetition. But if employees have a variety of different things to do, they're definitely going to be a little more engaged and happier. And also, you're going to have complete coverage. So it's going to be easier to cover off any call-offs or unforeseen absences, especially if you have an employee and they're cross-trained in 4 different places. You could always pull them to backfill that person who wasn't able to come in that day. And then I would say another good thing about cross-training is that it's also going to be easier on HR to create the schedule. Schedule days can always be a little stressful, trying to place everyone and work around, time off requests. So if you have those people that are cross-trained in different areas, it gives us and HR a lot more flexibility to put the right people at the right place at the right time, which is always the goal of a perfect schedule. So that is definitely a really great benefit of cross-training.
Yeah, I think
and then I would just say some of the things to consider. Again, you're going to have increased cost and time. So proper training hours will need to be allocated for the trainer and the trainee. Depending on how your company works, you're going to either have to maybe save payroll hours to put these hours aside to make sure you can train everyone. Or if it's a company-wide rollout, they should probably allocate you training hours. And then another thing that I've just noticed from my personal experience is that you might get a resistance from leadership. And but meaning by that is team leaders, they're going to be resistant to share their all-star employees with other areas of the business, because you're really going to want to focus on cross-training those employees that have great attendance, that are always, great attitude and perform well. Those are who you're going to focus on cross-training. So team leaders that already have them in their area are going to be resistant and aren't going to want to share. And then the last thing, again, you might get a little bit of employee resistance. Some people just don't like change, and a common thing that I've heard throughout my career is either they want to stay in their initial role, but also they don't want to work outside their pay grade. I'm sure other people have heard this as well. It's a little bit of a frustrating phrase that comes around, but that's something you're going to run into when it comes to cross-training. So, yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that Henry Ford came up with the idea of putting people on the production line and everyone specializing and being super specialized in that one part. But I think it was Toyota and the lean manufacturing movement. It was people will have a lot more engagement in their roles if they're doing different things and not doing the same thing every day. I think when you're some of these things with cross-training, it's easy to see how it makes it easier to build good schedules and things like that, but it's quite hard to measure how much more satisfaction we're giving workers by when they do know how to do more than one thing.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And then also, if they're satisfied and they're good employees, you're going to have lower turnover. And then obviously high turnover equals high cost as well for replacing employees.
That's a really important point, Meg. And also communication becomes really important when we're talking about cross-training and communicating why we're doing it.
Yes.
What are the reasons that the organization wants to do that? And I think that's the same thing if you start employing auto scheduling or whatever you decide you're going to do to help boost productivity. You want to make sure and communicate clearly and transparently why this is being done.
Yes. Yeah.
I saw we just got a question from David about Six Sigma. I think it could become more, it's a fairly wide group of people and a fairly wide organization, but I think it might be a good impetus for doing it. I think it might help get more commercial people on board with the idea of doing more Six Sigma and embracing that further and putting the investment into some of these things like cross-training. I think it's going to be a good impetus for a lot of this stuff. Okay. Any other questions? This is sort of the learning part of sort of the ideas we had. So it's probably a good time to ask any other questions you have about cross-training or upskilling that's sort of related. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next section, which is more HR.
And if there are any other questions that come through, I did have a little bit more to add, but I didn't want to. I'm really passionate about cross-training, so I had some more things I'd like to add. But if you guys have questions, I would be happy to give you my opinion.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Okay, so these next three are probably things that are easier for HR to get involved in, and probably less of a big change across the whole organization, sort of more in the HR wheelhouse. Scheduling, when we start looking at sort of like workforce optimization and how we can make people more productive, it's kind of obvious that if you have people working at the right time, doing the right things, they're going to be more productive. If you're arriving to work and other things aren't ready for you to go, or there's no customers yet, you're obviously not going to be able to do very much. So a lot of the scheduling work we do is around demand-based. How can we match up when there's work to be done with the right amount of people at that time? And some of this is related to demand that goes up or down. Other times it's related to set ratios that are sort of in healthcare. You might have a set nursing ratio of your skilled nursing hours. So there's two parts to it, but it's fairly similar problems. There's obviously we're getting a lot of questions as well, which we'll come back to. But this is really the biggest lever you can have. If you get your shift planning working better, your scheduling working better, we're seeing clients have 2 to 4% improvements in productivity per hour. So that's looking at how much output, how many sales someone can handle every hour, and then seeing how much that improves over time. So before the system, after the system, we see a lot of people are still using Excel for their schedules. We see a lot of people that have systems that the people who actually make the schedule, the operational people, don't even use, or don't know how to use, or don't know how to get value from. So if the HR team isn't providing tools that the operational people can use to build their schedules, then people are probably just doing it in Excel, and they're probably not doing it very efficient ways. And that's really where we see some of the biggest potential impact coming from. While we're waiting for some questions on this, do we want to go back to some of these other questions?
Yeah, I was going to say, I saw a question come in from Paula. And she's asking, when a business cross trains, isn't it common to increase wages even slightly? Yes, and I think that's kind of part of what the employee is going to expect. So I know a lot of businesses, maybe from like a retail perspective, each department sometimes are paid different wages. So when you cross train them and you cross train them into a higher wage bracket, it might be an extra 50 cents an hour. Usually how I've seen it done is that depending on what their shift is, so if that day, if they're cashiering, they're making their cashier rate. The next day, if they're doing something like that gets paid a little bit more, say they're in the grocery department, then when we schedule them, we would pay them for that job.
Yeah, I think an interesting thing there is some of the payroll challenges that come with that. So if you start having different rates for different roles, different rates for different locations, you really do need the systems in place at that point to help with that. And we'll talk about that more, some sort of best practice around doing that if those people are interested in.
Yeah, one question also that came up was whether this is going to be a gradual, provided the federal minimum wage does increase. Will it be gradual? And the answer to that is yes, as it's proposed currently. And I believe it is 2025 when it would ultimately hit $15. A couple of our people in our audience make really good points about regionally how this could have an effect. The cost of living obviously is much higher in San Francisco than it is, as somebody points out, in Cincinnati. So there are those issues that will come up. And as we've seen, certain cities have implemented their own minimum wage, the $15 minimum wage. Chicago, of course, being one of them, Seattle, and Portland, Oregon, I believe, also has. But we've also seen the Fair Work Week also being implemented. So you're seeing these regions, and I have a feeling that, and this is just my opinion, that that's the way it's going to continue over the course of time, that regionally or jurisdictions, cities, municipalities, states even will be implementing these wage and hour issues.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think if you do have tipped employees, you're going to have the steepest increase in the minimum, because that needs to go from $2.50 to $15 over 5 years. So that's almost sort of doubling immediately. I think that's where you're going to see that's where it's going to be difficult to keep pace with productivity. For everyone else, you do have 4 years, so there's going to be a more gradual increase. But still, that will come fairly quickly, and it is scheduled to start this year if it does get passed. So.
Right, and I know that's how Chicago did, and I think Seattle did it as well, where it was just a gradual rollout. And I believe Chicago just finally hit $15 this year, so it started out at 13. Is that right, Meg? Did Chicago?
I believe we were at $13.50 last year, so we might be at 15 now.
Okay.
For Chicago.
Yes, correct.
Just a little bit wary of everyone's time. We do have a couple more slides to go, so we'll get through those pretty quickly, and then we'll come back to some more questions on some of those things. So this is probably one of the easiest ones to go look at straight away. As we're starting to pay people more, it's sort of a good time to see how accurate that you're actually paying the time that's happening. And we see it being very, very common to use timesheet rounding. So like people clock in before or after their shift, you just round it to the nearest hour. This is probably, if you're paying someone $2.50, $5 an hour, $7.50 an hour, that's probably not your biggest concern. But if you are battling a fairly big increase in wages, this is probably some low-hanging fruit to get a better handle on. And we're seeing the poll come in here. There's a pretty big range. A lot of people are rounding. So definitely something to look into. A good alternative is if your system does allow it, you can ask the question when the employee, a lot of people, the reason they round is because employees start early and I don't want to pay them for that time. A good alternative to that is like before they clock in, you can either have them be locked out, or I think the best option is to ask them why they're clocking in early. Like, hi, you're clocking in early today. Why is that? And sort of get that permission from the employee to find out, are they actually on the clock or are they just sort of getting ready to work? Definitely worth looking into and considering. And there is some state-specific laws around that, so look into that. I think in New York particularly. And then the last sort of suggestion we have is about overtime. Again, it seems fairly obvious, but we have some more practical tips of some things you can do here. So obviously, as the base rate increases for everyone, the minimum wage increases, the downsides of playing overtime is getting even worse. So I've split this into two parts. So there's really two types of overtime. One is overtime that you sort of knew in advance was going to happen. It's on the schedule. It's sort of like locked in a week before or a few days before. So if you have that sort of overtime, go and look into why that's happening. Is it because managers can't see it? A lot of the time we see it caused because employees are shared across locations and they don't have a centralized scheduling system. So they don't realize that Bob already worked 20 hours this week at another location. Or it can just be caused because you haven't been able to recruit enough people, which I think this was happening before COVID. It was pretty hard to find staff in some of these roles. So recruitment was stretched to get enough staff out there. So those are all things that I think are pretty fixable, and we really want to be trying to avoid planned overtime. Like that's really something that we should be able to make a better plan for. The second one is like unplanned overtime. So this is when the shift was scheduled to be a certain time, but ended up being longer or shorter. Like ended up there was some extra work to do, or which I think that's probably the hardest one to handle. The one that's easier to handle is a shift is dropped, an employee drops a shift like without notice, they're sick or they need to take time off for some reason. And then the employee that takes over that shift is going into overtime. And this is really one that we see happening a lot, and we think that can really be handled much better with proper shift swapping applications, apps, and things for employees to manage that better and to give managers better insight into what's actually going on. Cool. We are really
so Josh,
I
Josh, I do want to ask you a question about overtime. I've noticed that I found one study that states that there's a 10%, when you have a 10% increase in overtime, that will lead to a slight cut in employee productivity. So are those two things, is that necessarily the case? I mean, and how do you deter overtime with your organization? So, and build your productivity.
Yeah, so I think that's not even something I was taking into account. I think that's really talking about how people are going to be tired. People aren't going to be at their best if they've already worked 40 hours that week or 12 hours on that day. So avoiding that has other productivity benefits. I think that would certainly happen. And a lot of what we're trying to do here is give people better tools, give managers, frontline managers, better tools to stop that from happening. Really put it in people's face. Things like alerts. Hey, this person's going to go into overtime. Like what to act on that on the day or the day before. Excellent.
And also, I'm just curious, minimum wage, potentially laying off employees, understaffing, is that initially going to be an issue for organizations?
Yeah, well, I think it can become a bit of a vicious cycle because you're understaffed, so then you have to get your existing employees to work more overtime, and you end up really not getting ahead at all. So that's definitely something to be wary of. And I think that's why we put the cross training and upskilling things in there, because the more people you can choose from that can fill a role, the more flexibility you have in that scheduling. But certainly something to be aware of and to try not to shoot yourself in the foot with laying off people and then just ending up paying other people overtime. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. I just wanted to quickly discuss some next steps. We know this was a fairly broad webinar, so we put some steps together here. The hard thing about all workforce related things is it's always a combination of HR and operations, the company leadership, the financial people. So just circulating some of these ideas inside the organization, I think is a good start, and it's a good reason to start talking about it because of the minimum wage changes that are coming. Run a bit of an assessment now. You can either do this sort of more formally. We have a tool that you can use for that, or you can just run it yourself. Like you can go have a look at how your scheduling systems are used. What is the employee experience when they do want to drop a shift? What do managers have to do in that situation? And probably the easiest thing that everyone can go do today is just look at their timekeeping process and why that is. Like, why do we use that rounding strategy that we have? Yeah, so we've put it. That seemed like a lot, so we put it into a bit of an assessment tool. It's designed to help people assess the current maturity of your workforce productivity. So where are some of these things sitting at? Where, as lots of people said, lots of people sort of maxed out their upskilling. So that's something that might not be much more they can do. So we need to look at some of these other options. The idea of it's useful for like working out which new programs and initiatives are going to be good. How do we want to, how do we want to prioritize some of these? Which one's going to make the most sense first? Jamie from our team is running that. If you do want to be involved in that, she's going to reach out and she can sort of talk about it. To make it more credible, you do need some financial and operational information. If you're going to give this to your CFO and you don't really know what your current productivity level is, I don't think it's going to have the same impact. So putting a bit more work into it, does really pay off with the credibility of the result you'll get from doing these type of assessments. But if you do need some help with that, Jamie and myself are here. We are over time, but we can probably look at some of these questions, Rick, as we to wrap up. Let's see, we've got a bunch here.
Okay.
How far will the general public pay for fast food restaurants products? I think that's anyone's guess. What do you think, Rick?
Yeah, I think if you like driving through Wendy's or McDonald's and the cost of your meal goes up 50 cents, I think you're okay with paying that. I think it's an incredibly competitive field, that industry. So I think they're doing whatever they can to keep their costs down. As you've seen, some of these places have kiosks where you can put in the order. So they're potentially cutting their workforce already in preparation for some of these things. So I think people are still going to keep paying for their meals. I don't see them changing.
Yeah, I think in general, fast food restaurants have a lower labor cost percentage than sort of your nicer restaurants. So the amount that they will need to increase prices will potentially be less, particularly with the tipped minimum stuff changing. I think fast food is the least likely to be impacted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Gary's got some more questions about compression. That comes up every time we do a webinar about this, doesn't it, Rick?
Yes, it does.
I think we can look into that a bit more and maybe come back with some more content around how to handle that. So basically, we're talking about if you would currently pay everyone like your highest performing people $16 an hour, and you're going to need to pay everyone $15 an hour, those people are going to become upset. So yeah, and Mark, thanks for doing that calculation for everyone. Yeah, the overtime rate will be $22.50. That's the math in my head says that's correct. So you can see how that really adds up if you're paying a lot of that out.
Kent had an interesting point. He said his past experience with minimum wage increases is that employees with higher wages, say 50K to 100K, who are salaried, they stay stagnant or are depressed to make up for the new increase for the minimum wage. I just think that's an interesting question because from my past experience, we had just an overall company minimum wage increase, and we actually had a lot of complaints and dissatisfaction from our team leaders and our lower level managers because then their gap is closing. So now their cashiers are making, and they were making say $6 more an hour than them, and now they're making $4 more an hour with more responsibilities. So it is from what I've seen, it's a trickle effect where everyone's gonna want more.
Right, we did address that in the last webinar.
Yeah.
That question basically came up, and yeah, I mean, you're going to experience a certain amount of jealousy when somebody has their wages raised to the wage that, say, their manager is already making, and yeah, I think that is definitely an issue. Again, yeah. I just want to keep coming back to being able to communicate some of these things to your employees. Okay, we are going to be raising our minimum wage to X number of dollars. Here's how we are going to how we're going to deal with that. And I think being able to communicate those kinds of things is extremely valuable.
Yeah, and you also get the pushback from the employees who have worked their way up to the minimum wage. And then next thing you know, you have someone who just started and they're starting at the wage that you worked 5 years to get to. And it really is going to depend on how the company handles that and their approach. But I just could see from HR perspective, some more, disgruntled employees who've been there a while and that actually know the business pretty well. So they're actually would be worth, a little bit more than that minimum wage. It's just if the company can pull that.
Yeah. Really good. Sorry to interrupt, Meg, but we got a really good question from Shari.
Oh, okay.
I couldn't answer it live, I think. Nah. So everyone can see. Yeah, I think this is a really common problem, and I think if this was me, I would be looking at some of the things I could do that aren't going to cost the business more, but might make employment more attractive or more flexible. So, what are your options around letting people work at more flexible times? In manufacturing, that's probably difficult because you might have a line or something that you need people to do. But what else can you do to add sort of some of these softer benefits that other companies might have trouble doing? So we know that employees really value flexibility. You might have things like a shutdown at Christmas or things like that can differentiate you a little bit compared to Amazon or a really huge company like that where it's not the same level. But I think that is a really big concern. Rick, did you have any other ideas?
Yeah, it's definitely a concern because you want to maintain that image without breaking the bank. Well, consider some of your options. I mean, is flex work an option? Are there opportunities for you to cut overtime to save money? What are some of your options that are available to get creative with your scheduling or to shift some of your hours? If you're a manufacturing company, do you have to run 2 shifts or can you compress it to 1? Just an example. So I think that being able to offer varying creative scheduling can be a benefit and may not be the only option, but it's definitely an option.
Yeah, I saw Kathy just mentioning that taxes may need to increase. I don't think we've even really thought about the flow-on effects of some of this, and that's how things like what Kathy's mentioning is really how inflation is caused. Because throughout the whole economy, you're seeing price increases, taxes are going up, and it sort of rolls on. So probably not relevant to our field, but I definitely think we're going to see a lot of that in local governments around the country. Might be a good time to wrap up. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think we are kind of coming to the end of our time here. So overall, I just wanted to thank everyone for their time and for joining us and attending. We really did get a lot of great conversation, questions and feedback from the audience, and we really appreciate all of that. Also, we're always coming out with new and relevant content, so keep an eye out for any future workforce webinars. We usually do them on a monthly basis as right now, but that could always change. But overall, I think this just wraps it up. So thank you all once again, and I hope you have a great day.